The senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, all of us are extremely concerned, and I mean all of us, Senator Risch and all the Republican colleagues and me and all of the Democratic colleagues about the suffering and famine that's upon the folks in Gaza. And today I'm here to offer a resolution for consideration on which 46 senators on our side agree. And although we've not had signatories on the Republican side, I know that my colleagues on the Republican side are very concerned about the devastating absence of food and medicine and baby formula for 2 million Palestinians that are living in Gaza. It's been 74 days, Mr. President, since aid trucks were allowed to transit into Gaza. That's a decision that the Israeli government has made under Prime Minister Netanyahu. And what does alarm me is that it's very clear under international law, it's very clear on prior actions that this United States Senate has taken, that in a conflict, as a tactic of war, starving the civilian population is illegal, impermissible, and just wrong, absolutely wrong. And as an indication of the suffering, this is a young child who died in her parents' arms, Janine Ishkafi. And that was due to no food, no baby formula to feed this young person. And the UN has released a report that indicates if food is not brought into Gaza, within the next 48 hours, 14,000 more infants will die. And they will die in the arms of their mother or father. So this question of should aid get in, obviously it should. It's not right for aid to be withheld as an instrument of war. And regrettably, that appears to have been a decision that has been made by the Israeli government. It's not right, it's not necessary, it's not helpful, and it is extraordinarily harmful to innocent children, to innocent mothers. So my hope is that this Senate would pass a resolution making it very clear about our concern about the well-being of innocent Palestinians in Gaza, and that food that those Palestinians in Gaza need is right on the other side of the border. It's there. All it needs is to be transported from where it is into Gaza and then distributed. You know, I want to just quote a Palestinian about how dire that situation is. The words of a Palestinian, let me quote, "Believe it or not," and this is, by the way, at a moment when bombs are still dropping, where people who've been relocated a dozen times are having to relocate again, where the 2 remaining hospitals in Han Yunis have been bombed, where there's no security whatsoever. This is what the Palestinian said that sums it up. Believe it or not, people no longer care about bombs, rockets, or even death. What consumes them now is food, how to find it, how to feed their children. It is impossible to describe how hard life has become. People walk around in a daze, dizzy from malnutrition and despair. People are confused, anxious, and exhausted. They are literally dying of hunger. At this point, they would accept anything just to survive. People are fainting in the streets. They look like skin and bones, pale and dizzy. If you saw them, you would break down and cry. That's the word of a Palestinian in Gaza. Mr. President, we've got to feed those people. The food is there. We all want those innocent people to survive, and avoid famine. Let us do every single thing we can to persuade the Israeli Netanyahu government to get that food in to people who desperately need it. Mr. President, at this point, I want to yield to my colleague, Senator Van Hollen from Maryland.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I want to thank my friend and colleague, Senator from Vermont, Mr. Welch, for offering this resolution. And I just want to focus on the resolution itself for a moment, because you would think this is something that we could all agree on. I'm just reading the resolved clause here. Resolved that the Senate, Part 1, is gravely concerned with A, the humanitarian crisis and acute suffering of the Palestinian civilians in Gaza, and B, the suffering of the hostages and hostage families. So that's Section 1 of the resolved clause. As Senator Welch has said, I think we all acknowledge the terrible humanitarian disaster that Palestinian civilians are suffering under right now. President Trump just acknowledged it the other day. He said a lot of people are starving. Cindy McCain said, and I quote, "Families in Gaza are starving while the food they need is sitting at the border." 57 children have already died from malnutrition, and the reports are that 14,000 Palestinian children in Gaza are at imminent risk of death if they don't get more food. Now, just yesterday, after 78 days of a total siege and blockade on any food coming in to Gaza, a trickle of food began to get in, primarily because European countries began to say very loudly that what was happening was unacceptable, that it was a violation of international law. We're also hearing from the hostage families the urgency of putting an end to this conflict and resolving this to make sure their loved ones can come home. I was very glad to see Steve Witkoff be able to bring home Edan Alexander. Now we have to bring back the rest of the hostages, and the hostage families overwhelmingly have been calling on Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government to end the conflict, end the suffering on all sides, and bring their loved ones home. Now I want to just read the second part of this resolution, because it does what I understand so many of the hostages' families have been saying that we should do. It calls on the White House, the Department of State, and other relevant United States government agencies to urgently use all available diplomatic tools to bring about the release of the hostages, an immediate cessation of the blockade on food and humanitarian aid for Palestinian civilians, and a durable end to the conflict in Gaza. That's Part 1 and Part 2 of the resolve clause that I just read. And I want to thank Senator Welch, because he has written this in a way that you would think not a single senator could object to the words in this resolution. And so I do urge my colleagues to support it. Let's put an end to the suffering and starvation of Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Let's get the hostages home, and let's work to end this conflict in a way that ensures no more October 7th and ensures security and dignity for both Israelis and Palestinians alike. I yield back to the senator from Vermont.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen.
Senator from Vermont.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you again, Senator from Maryland. Mr. President, notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Foreign Relations be discharged from further consideration, and the Senate now proceed to Senate Res. 224. Further, that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table.
Action.
President.
Senator from Idaho.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object. Look, first of all, we have no disagreement with the suffering that's going on in Gaza. The problem we have here is, as we heard from both of these speakers, not one word was said as to whose fault this is. This is the fault of a group of people. And that group of people is Hamas. I heard them mention Israel several times. This is not Israel's fault. I heard them mention us, the United States. This is not our fault. I couldn't agree more with Senator Welch when he talks about the fact that we want an immediate ceasefire and for people to be fed there and things to get better there. It is so simple. It is so easy. It is totally in the hands of Hamas. If they release the hostages, they lay down their arms, and they surrender, not one more bullet will be fired, and there will be scads of trucks come into Gaza. That's how this ends. But can we end it? No. If we send trucks in, Senator, you know, you've seen the intelligence on this. When we send trucks of food in there, who eats? The soldiers eat. The Hamas soldiers eat. They starve the women and they starve the children. Not only do they starve them, they use them as human shields. And they set up their facilities, their military facilities, in hospitals, in schools, in mosques, in all kinds of places that they then wring their hands and say, oh my gosh, we've been attacked. Look, this is despicable. This is horrible. This is criminal. It's beyond human understanding how human beings could treat other human beings the same way, especially when you're related to them as they are in Palestine. So I agree that this needs to stop. But the first thing that needs to be said is that this is the fault of Hamas, and it is not our fault. And it doesn't matter if we rolled trucks in there tomorrow, that food would be taken, it would be stolen, it would be distributed by Hamas to their fighting soldiers, and the dying and the suffering of the women and children would continue. This thing is badly aimed. It does not in any way lay the fault where it belongs, and that is at the feet of Hamas. So based on all that, I share your objective. This gets us nowhere, and worse than that, it doesn't point out where the problem is. Madam President, I object.
Objections heard.
Madam President,
Senator from Vermont.
I want the Senator from Idaho, the esteemed chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, to know that when it comes to condemning Hamas for what it did on October 7th, for what it's done to the Palestinians in Gaza on an ongoing basis, I join you in condemning Hamas. And this resolution, Madam President, does not get into the question of fault. It gets into the question of suffering. It gets into the question of suffering of innocent people who at times have been victimized by Hamas, but whose families are hungry, who are starving. And the point of this resolution is to say, let's help them avoid starvation by supporting the delivery of the food and the medicine and the baby formula that they need. This in no way is going to solve the conflict. That's a point the senator made, and he's got a point to be made. But if we do all we can to facilitate the delivery of aid, it means that we're doing all we can to ease the suffering of innocent families who have been victimized. My view, Madam President, is that we should do all we can to alleviate the suffering, especially for these infants, these children, these women, and peace-loving Palestinians who want nothing more than to live in peace in their neighborhood. I yield back.
Senator from Idaho.
Madam President, I want to respond to that. First of all, I commend the senator for his appreciation for the suffering that's going on there. It is horrible. It's despicable. You've seen the photos. You've seen the video. It's a horrible, horrible situation. One of the difficulties I have with this is he is correct. This resolution does not assign fault, nor does it talk about fault. And that's one of the biggest problems I have with this. If this is going to be resolved, fault must be identified. The conditions on the ground has to be identified. And how this is going to be resolved has to be identified, none of which is considered in here. It is simply a suggestion that simply taking food there is going to resolve this problem. And we have done that. We have food there. It's ready to go in. As I said, 3 things need to happen, and it's in the hands solely of Hamas, not in Israel, not in Netanyahu, not in our president, not in the people of the United States' hands. It's in the hands of Hamas. And that is, if they simply release the hostages, lay down their arms and surrender, it's over. The food flows in. There's not another bullet fired. That's all that has to happen. But what has to be recognized in this is how this is going to end. There's only one way this can end, and that is with the complete and total destruction of Hamas. This is very similar to what the United States of America and its allies did in the late 1930s. We decided that the Nazis were so bad they could not exist as a military force, as a political force, or as a cultural force, and we decided they needed to be eliminated. That's what Israel has decided it has to do to protect itself. That's what it's doing. But Hamas can stop this, and they can stop it in a minute. And they're not showing any signs of that. And so what's going to happen is this thing's going to fight. This fight is going to go on until the last Hamas falls. Thank you.
Madam President.
The senator from Nevada.
Thank you, Madam President. We're not in a quorum call?
We are not.
Thank you. Madam President, Hardworking families in Nevada and all across this country are struggling to make ends meet because of rising costs on everything from groceries to housing, all of which has been made worse by Donald Trump's tariffs that are driving prices even higher. Nevadans, our families, we're being squeezed, and they need real relief. They need us to work together to lower costs for them. That's why I introduced the No Tax on Tips Act alongside Senator Ted Cruz from Texas, which would eliminate federal income taxes on tipped wages. For so many service and hospitality workers, tips aren't extra. It's part of their income that they use to make ends meet. Tips are how Nevadans pay their rent, cover their groceries, take care of their families, their kids. And Nevada has more tipped workers per capita than any other state. So this bill would mean immediate financial relief for countless hardworking families. No tax on tips was one of President Trump's key promises to the American people, which he unveiled in my state of Nevada. And I am not afraid to embrace a good idea wherever it comes from. So I agreed we need to get this done. It's not a time for politics, it's a time for progress for hardworking Americans. This bipartisan bill is a good idea that has supports from Democrats and Republicans, so we should pass it as soon as possible without any poison pills. The problem is that the House Republicans have included a version of the No Tax on Tips Act in their bigger budget bill, a bill that cuts Medicaid, SNAP, and other programs families rely on to give more tax breaks for billionaires and the ultra-wealthy. So we shouldn't be forcing working families to choose between keeping their health care or keeping their tips, which is why we want this bipartisan bill to pass on its own, not part of a harmful extreme budget bill. If we're serious about providing service employees with financial relief, let's do it now, let's do it today. Because the American people, they get sick and tired of Washington games. So let's pass this bill without playing politics, without taking away health care and food assistance from families who need it the most. Let's pass it by itself. And so that's why I'm calling on the Senate to pass the bipartisan No Tax on Tips Act right here, right now, as a standalone bill. We're going to cut taxes for real hardworking Americans, for Nevadans, for everyone, not just for billionaires. We're going to cut taxes on service workers' tips without cutting Medicaid or SNAP. And let's get this done with strong guardrails so CEOs and the ultra-wealthy don't exploit loopholes meant to help working people. And let's pass it today. Nevadans sent me here to fight for them. And so I'm going to keep working to lower costs, to raise wages, and make sure people who power our economy, our working families, can keep more of what they earn. And through this bipartisan bill, it shows that I'm not going to allow Washington gridlock and bipartisanship to block a bill without a fight. That's why we're going to pass it today, taking matters into my own hands with the support of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to pass our bipartisan No Tax on Tips Act by unanimous consent. And so, notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Finance be discharged from further consideration of S-129 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration.
Clerk will report.
S-129, a bill to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to eliminate the application of the income tax on qualified tips through a deduction allowed to all individual taxpayers and for other purposes.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection. The committee is discharged and the Senate will proceed.
I further ask that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Well, before I yield my time to this senator from Texas, I just want to say this is great news for Nevada. Our bill just passed. Our hospitality and service staff, they're working harder than ever while being squeezed by rising costs. And this bill, it's not the be-all, end-all. but it's going to offer immediate financial relief while the Senate continues to work to lower costs and find other avenues of relief for hardworking families. Madam President, I yield back. Thank you.
Madam President.
The senator from Texas.
You know, I remember as a kid in Sunday school thinking what it would have been like to live in Israel in the age of the apostles, in the time of miracles. And yet, perhaps we have been transformed to another time of miracles. Yesterday, I was at the White House where President Trump signed into law bipartisan legislation, my legislation, the Take It Down Act, that I authored with Senator Amy Klobuchar to protect women, to protect teenage girls, to protect young people online from non-consensual intimate images. We saw both parties come together and pass landmark legislation. And just a moment ago, 24 hours later, we saw the same thing happen. And so I thank my colleague from Nevada for moving for this to pass by unanimous consent. And I want everyone to reflect on what you just saw happen because it is consequential. Last year, in the midst of the presidential campaign, President Trump at a rally in Las Vegas announced his policy proposal of no tax on tips. And Madam President, you will recall that the week after he announced that, he came and had lunch with the Republican senators, and he told us the backstory of where the idea came from. And he said he was sitting at a hotel in Las Vegas, getting ready to go to his rally, and he said he was having lunch there, and he said a waitress came by, and he said she was beautiful, which I believe him. And he said she was complaining about the burden and the paperwork of paying taxes on tips and how challenging it was. And he said he pulled out a pad of paper and he just wrote on the pad of paper, no tax on tips. He said, what do you think of this? She said, great. And he went to the rally and he announced it, and as he told us, the entire crowd went nuts. Now, I got to say, when he announced that policy, I thought that was policy genius. The next week, I drafted legislation to implement no taxes on tips. And I introduced it in the Senate the very next week. And within days, both senators from Nevada joined my bill as co-sponsors. As the senator from Nevada just described, she told me on the floor, she said, 25% of all workers in the state of Nevada are tipped workers. And this is common sense, bipartisan tax reform. Look, I think we ought to be fighting for waiters and waitresses. We ought to be fighting for bartenders, taxi cab drivers, Uber drivers. We ought to be fighting for beauticians and nail salon workers. We ought to be fighting for all the men and women who are working and working hard. We ought to be fighting for casino workers. Sorry to leave them out. As a longtime poker player, I certainly don't want to leave them out. But we ought to be fighting for blue-collar workers across this country. And I will say I've urged the House of Representatives, I've urged the White House that we should take up no taxes on tips in the House and pass it. And I said, look, if the House passes it, I think there's a very real chance the Senate will pass it. It's bipartisan legislation. And what we just saw is the Senate passing no tax on tips 100 to nothing. Every Democrat voted yes, every Republican voted yes. And by the way, the backstory, just kind of pulling the curtain back on how this process operates. The way the process operates is when you're seeking to pass something by unanimous consent, you circulate what's called a hotline, and every senator gets the chance to say, are you going to object? And on the Republican side, every senator said, nope, goodbye me. And on the Democrat side, every senator said, nope, goodbye me. And so this is now passed, and we are sending it to the House of Representatives. Here's the good news. With what we just saw now, the certainty that we will see no tax on tips become the law of the land, I think is very close to 100%. As the senator from Nevada mentioned, it is included in the House's One Big Beautiful Bill, and whether it passes freestanding or as part of the bigger bill, one way or another, no tax on tips is going to become law, and give real relief to hardworking Americans. So I'm proud of what the Senate just did, and I commend Democrats and Republicans, even in a time of partisan division, coming together and agreeing on this common sense policy. I think that's terrific for workers in all 50 states. And with that, I yield the floor.
Senator from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Eviatar David has always loved music, singing and playing instruments with his brother Eli and his sister Yaelah at Shabbat dinners. Eviatar dreams of becoming a music producer one day. And that love of music led Eviatar to the Negev Desert for the Nova Music Festival on October 7th, 2023. For months, he'd been looking forward to a weekend of music and friends. But instead, Madam President, Eviatar is now, as I speak these words on the Senate floor, living his 591st day of captivity in a Hamas dungeon under Gaza. His brother Eli told me recently that another hostage recently freed brought him a message from Eviatar, that Eviatar misses most of all playing music with his family. Instead, Eviatar has been starved and kept in chains with a bag over his head. He and his best friend, Gil Gilboa Dalal, have been held together and tortured together. Eviatar and Guy both have younger sisters, older brothers, parents, friends, whose lives are shattered by their absence. This, Madam President, is Eviatar before. But recent photos show a man abused and malnourished. And he was recently taken to witness the release of other hostages and then returned to captivity simply to torment him. Madam President, I first met Eviatar's brother Eli when he visited Atlanta and then hosted Eli at my office here in the Senate. And I was inspired by the tenacity of his hope and his relentless effort to ensure his brother is not forgotten. And today, Madam President, I rise to demand Eviatar's freedom and to demand yet again the release of all hostages held in Gaza. Many of us in Atlanta's Jewish community, including Or HaTorah, Beth Jacob, B'nai Torah, and now all of the synagogues of the Atlanta Rabbinical Assembly, have decided to adopt Eviatar's case, to call relentlessly for his immediate release and to ensure he is not forgotten or left for dead. This 24-year-old man has now spent 2 birthdays in brutal captivity, where he remains right now at this moment. But he belongs at home with his family. Eviatar, you are not forgotten. Free Eviatar David. Free him now. Thank you, Madam President.
The senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Madam President. Notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent the Committee on Finance be discharged from further consideration of S-Res 217 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration, that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Madam President, reserving the right to object,
Senator from Idaho.
I would like to make some remarks, but if my colleague is going to make remarks, I would certainly yield to her first.
Thank you. Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Is there objection?
To object. Then I will object, and we can make our remarks anyway.
Okay. Objection is heard. Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Madam President. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Secretary of Health and Human Services, is presenting a clear and present danger to the health and well-being of the American people. He oversees 13 agencies that are critical to U.S. health policy and the health of our nation. One such agency, the National Institutes of Health, is the world's leading agency for public health research, and I am proud to represent many of the scientists who work there as the senator from Maryland. This is the place that the nation looks to for discoveries in public health. This is where the world looks to fight global health crises. This is the beacon of American exceptionalism. Over the last 40 years, NIH has helped reduce deaths from heart disease by 75%. Deaths from stroke are down 75%. And NIH funding has led the fight to save countless lives with groundbreaking discoveries. NIH is the greatest credit to sustain medical research in history. But now, we're dealing with an administration that is a direct threat to our health. Since Donald Trump has taken office, NIH has fired 1,300 employees and has canceled more than $2 billion in federal research grants. He wants to cut the NIH budget by 40%. And these cuts would be carried out by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., one of the most unqualified individuals that we've seen to hold that position. Secretary Kennedy took an oath to faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which he was about to enter. And to this point, he has utterly failed and is making Americans sicker. Look at what he's done in just 4 months. We are currently watching the largest single measles outbreak in our nation in 25 years. 25 years. 1,000 cases, and a third of them are children younger than 5 years old. 3 people have died, including 2 young children. For years, Secretary Kennedy, without an ounce of medical training, has spread lies and conspiracy theories about safe and effective vaccines. Vaccines that literally prevent measles. A qualified HHS secretary would highlight the effectiveness of vaccines and urge people to continue getting vaccinated. A capable secretary would have some sense of compassion for suffering children. The secretary we have instead chose to downplay the deaths and encourage untested treatments. This is dangerous. Americans will get sicker, and in fact, they already have. Our nation has made incredible gains in IVF and in fertility treatment, raising the birth rate through IVF dramatically over the last 30 years. But just last month, Secretary Kennedy fired the entire team at CDC who works on IVF and infertility research. Secretary Kennedy fired most of the employees at the CDC's Division of Reproductive Health, which helps to promote healthy pregnancies. And Secretary Kennedy fired staff at the Maternal and Child Health Bureau, which oversees important programs that support children and pregnant women. Countless women across the country have become mothers thanks to the incredible advancements in IVF. And a good number of this president's women supporters supported him because he vowed to make the treatment more accessible. How dare this man take that away from them? Our nation has made great progress in the fight to eliminate HIV and AIDS, building on an understanding of how to treat the virus and getting closer to finding a cure. Until now, Secretary Kennedy has now cut funding for dozens of HIV-related research grants. Did you know that there's a national firefighter registry that was set up to study the link between the hazards of the job and firefighters developing cancers? Well, that registry has now been taken down at Secretary Kennedy's bidding. This is a part of a heartless trend. They're destroying what decades of research has built. The billions in funding cuts and thousands of staff cuts threaten the race to find cures for Alzheimer's, ALS, cancer, and other devastating illnesses. The impact will be felt far beyond our borders, and it will be generational. For decades, we have taken the lead on the global stage in research and development. We've taken the lead in fighting global health challenges. Many of the world's brightest researchers come here to join the fight. The top research agencies around the world partner with us. Public health is a responsibility that we must lead. RFK is single-handedly destroying that reputation, setting us back potentially decades. The eyes of the world are on us. Most look to us to lead. Some look for us to stumble, but they're watching to see what we do. Having Secretary Kennedy as the face of our nation's health and research operation sends a terrible message to the rest of the world and a terrifying one to the American people. He's in over his head, he cannot do the job, and he needs to step down for the health of our nation. And to my colleagues, we took an oath as well. We have a duty to do what is right. And we know that RFK Jr. is not right for America. I want to thank my colleague and partner here in Maryland, Senator Van Hollen, as well as Senators Wyden and Warren for joining me in this effort.
Madam President.
Senator from Idaho.
Madam President, I'll now explain the reason for my objection. This is another of many attempts that have been made to stop the efforts of President Trump and his cabinet and the rest of the administration from downsizing our bloated bureaucracy and trying to bring a little bit of control to the amazing growth of our federal government without causing the damage that is always alleged that it is being done. From groundbreaking biomedical advancements through the NIH to critical health care coverage for America's most vulnerable patients, the Department of Health and Human Services oversees many of the federal government's most essential functions. But far too often, these programs fall short of their well-intended purpose. Bureaucratic overreach has resulted in the loss of trust from many Americans. Waste, fraud, and abuse has contributed to excessive spending without meaningful improvements in outcomes. And that's driving our national debt now to $37 or $38 trillion. Secretary Kennedy has committed to addressing these failures. He's made himself and his staff available to Congress and the American people to restore faith in our institutions. When issues have arisen, Secretary Kennedy has worked quickly to remedy the problem. In fact, in recent days, Secretary Kennedy has appeared before 2 Senate committees to have an open, transparent conversation about the department's efforts. Last week, the Senate Finance Committee moved to advance more nominees who will assist in the department's management and communication with Congress. Secretary Kennedy and his team deserve time to deliver on the promise of putting patients first, promoting transparency, and following the science. For these reasons, Madam President, I objected to the request.